So telling histories of radical change is what I think the books in this course are principally about. They're about recounting history, but not in terms of a sequence of predictable, necessary causes and effects, but precisely the opposite, breaking with rules of the past, whether in terms of racism, sexism, or now the books that we're looking into now are about adventure, adventure for its own sake, using the natural world as an arena to discover to test and discover what human life is for. So, how have adventure narratives shaped our sense of human purpose, in particular, our sense of human capacity for change, self transformation, or transformation through, exploration, discovery in the natural world. Um, Hopefully, I'm going to have a friend of mine, a medieval scholar, to interview about medieval romance narratives of adventure, and get his perspective on the purpose and function of adventure narratives like King Arthur, those sorts of romance narratives. More recently, historically, colonialism, imperialism, and especially the conquest of the Americas by Europeans, has done a lot to shape our imagination of adventure and belief in the capacity for self-transformation. First of all, I just want to reflect on the appeal in the American imagination of the landscape. The way in which, in the American imagination, freedom, adventure has our ideals and goals, motivations that have been projected onto the land. I think this video here is a depiction of world population growth over time. I think each dot is 1 million people or something. And I just want you to notice how the density of Europe correlates with the very sparse population in the Americas, and how this is an accident of geography. That the our planet happened to have this dense population growth over here, and then this whole other set of continents with all these resources underpopulated. That's an accident, circumstantial accident, but it's done so much to transform who we are. That's a very sobering video. Um, so that is a representation of empirical information, empirical data, population growth. So that is not about human meaning per se, in the way I was talking about earlier, that literature represents, and art, imaginative arts represent human meaning. Um, but what it does represent is a crowding out of space. So that's to say that to the extent that our meanings are dependent upon space, are dependent upon consuming the landscape, owning the landscape, those meanings are not going to be sustainable. The acceleration that we see there of population growth um, makes it clear that to the extent these problems are affected by population, they're getting more and more in our face. We're going to have to confront the uh, unsustainable ways in which we exploit the environment and each other rather quickly, because it seems like just a exponential acceleration. So, what's the appeal of adventure narratives, narratives of adventure, especially out into nature, to the wilderness? Why do we like to read them? What's the appeal to us to read them? What's the appeal to emulate them, uh, live them out in real life, one way or another? Um, on the one hand, it's you can see it's continuous with this frontier mentality. It's about exploiting an unsustainable fantasy of having this wilderness to yourself, realizing yourself um, in an uncontaminated landscape, uncrowded landscape. Um, on the other hand, that's a kind of romanticization or glamorization of the colonial conquest of the frontier. Um, on the other hand, though, I think it's also about the narratives that we are reading in this class really emphasize a sort of rejection of consumerist society, ownership, um, possessive individuality, defining oneself in terms of what one owns and the rat race, social rat race, um, and seeking a kind of humbling or by nature exposing oneself to the power of nature, testing oneself, um, uh, rather than conquering nature. Um, or that's that's the test. It's kind of exploring that balance. What degree of testing is necessary, and how much does it need to cost nature in order to prove myself against it? These are issues I think are interesting to keep in mind as we go forward with these adventure narratives. I want to start out with a really fascinating movie made by a guy in the 70s, I think, when home movies, were very novel. Having movie making equipment was very novel, I think, at the time. And he went out into the wild. He went out to Alaska and all by himself and built a cabin. But what's cool is he filmed it all. And so I think that's kind of interesting. Like, he wants to get away, but he wants to document it. He wants to be seen doing it, And so I think it's interesting just thinking about, on the one hand, he wants to conquest, he wants to get his cabin and sort of his piece of land. He's staking out his self as his property. But on the other hand, he's communicating it, like, or at least dreaming about other people seeing him doing it. Um, that I think is another, dimension that it has more to do with sharing a kind of fantasy of adventure, wilderness, self-discovery than about actually conquering the land. That's just something interesting to think about, the difference between the film, um, the actual uh, settling of the land, and making a film of it. I'll just show you the first minute, but it's about an hour long. It's just amazing. He builds all his own tools, his utensils for cooking. It's really extraordinary. But again, what makes it even more extraordinary is thinking that he's filmed everything. So even as he's doing all this construction, sort of the biggest, most complex level of construction is this, a communication of some kind, even if not to any audience, just to an imaginary audience. I think filming himself is a social act. So to think of this thing on the one hand as like a, settlement, conquest, but on the other hand, an artwork, a communication, I think is an interesting aspect to all these adventure narratives that we're going to be looking at.
It was good to be back in the wilderness again, where everything seems at peace. I was alone, just me and the animals. It was a great feeling, free once more to plan and do as I pleased. Beyond was all around me. My dream was a dream no longer. I suppose I was here because this was something I had to do. Not just dream about it, but do it. I suppose, too, I was here to test myself. Not that I had never done it before, but this time it was to be a more thorough and lasting examination. What was I capable of that I didn't know yet? Could I truly enjoy my own company for an entire year? And was I equal to everything this wild land could throw at me? I had seen its moods in late spring, summer, and early fall, but what about the winter? Would I love the isolation then? With its bone-stabbing cold, its ghostly silence? At age 51, I intended to find out. Another 100 yards, and I broke out of the brush to my pile of cabin logs I had cut last July. I sat down and leaned against them, and while I chewed on a chunk of smoked salmon, my eyes wandered over the peeled logs. That had been a big job last summer. Hard work, but I enjoyed it. It was cool in the timber, and there were mornings I could see my breath. I had harvested the logs from a stand of spruce less than 300 yards from where they were now piled. The logs were a great deal lighter now than they were then, and could be handled easily enough.